in the debt of those countries, and they are very much engaged in making sure that those countries are taking appropriate policies. As I've explained in previous venues, the Federal Reserve has a swap line with the European Central Bank. That is not an obligation of any European government directly. The European Central Bank is highly creditworthy. It is owned by the central banks of all the countries in the Eurozone. And moreover, they give us euros as collateral, so it's a swap of currency rather than a loan per se. They lend the proceeds onto their banking system in dollars, and there's some important reasons for that. But just from an exposure point of view, they take all the credit risk, all the interest rate risk, and all the exchange rate risk, and I think it's a good bargain for us.
Are you able to quantify the exposure of the U.S. taxpayer to the risk through the IMF and elsewhere?
Through the IMF? I don't
US
have the number exactly, but it would be in the tens of billions.
It may even be higher than that, I think. Do you believe that it's appropriate for the United States, for the Fed, and hence the United States taxpayer, to have a greater exposure through the IMF, or are we at about where we ought to be? Or should we decrease our exposure?
Well, I think the IMF plays a really important role in helping to stabilize countries that are in stress. The administration, the Treasury Secretary is our director, and he has the most direct responsibility for the IMF, and he's been very clear that he's not supportive of any increase in the U.S. contribution to the IMF, and so I would leave that to his judgment. His view is, as I understand it, you should speak to him, of course, his view is that it's up to the Europeans first to take the necessary actions to stabilize the situation.
Let me switch very quickly in the brief moments that I have left to the comments that you made about health care and Medicare, Medicaid. Our discretionary budget is about $1 trillion. The amount of the deficit is greater than $1 trillion. So one could do away with all discretionary spending, isn't it correct? You could do away with all discretionary spending and not even get to a balanced budget without addressing Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and
well, part of the $1 trillion deficit is due to the fact that the economy is in very weak condition, and the CBO suggested that if the economy returns to normal, say by 2017, that the deficit would be more in the order of 4 to 5%, which would be on the order of, in today's terms, 60 to 75 billion. So that's not, the balance is not quite what you said, but what I said before is true, that discretionary spending cannot bear the entire brunt of deficit closing. It's just not arithmetically possible.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Tonko.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Bernanke, Chairman Bernanke, thank you for appearing before the committee. I represent a part of upstate New York that hosts the third fastest growing high-tech jobs hub in the country. And we have a higher share of our workforce in green-collar jobs than anywhere else in America. And the innovation economy in our region isn't just a talking point. It's a reality that's paying bills for many, many families. Came about with a huge bit of planning and the investment from both public and private sectors in providing the industrial clustering that's currently underway. So I'm interested in your comments about the investments that need to be part of the response to a troubled economy that encourage investments in R&D, in the development of skills of a labor force that's essential for an ideas economy, and also the requirement of sound public infrastructure. After 20 years of investment through work in the policy development in the State Assembly, and when I was at NYSERDA, the State Energy Research and Development Authority, we saw what happened when people brought it all together and now enabled us to experience this comeback. Interestingly, when I arrived here, I saw a lot of tug against investment in these given dynamics that you made mention of. Can you develop further for us the benefit, the value added that comes with this focus on R&D, on skill set, and on infrastructure?
Yes, there's a lot of evidence that clustering can be beneficial, as you described. If you have a number of high-tech industries, for example, close together, they can share ideas and suppliers, workforce, and the like. The public sector has a role there. One of the great strengths of the United States is our university system. Many of the high-tech clusters, I don't know about the one you're speaking of, have grown up in the context of a strong university where there's a lot of exchange between scientists or other professionals in the university and in the private sector. And of course, the U.S. government is, has many, supports university education in many direct and indirect ways. Of course, it also supports public education for younger people, and the high-tech industries require skilled workers, a range of people, but certainly people who are conversant with math and science is very important. So there's some important roles. Infrastructure, I think, while that's certainly a topic of debate about how much and what kind, I think most people agree that there's certain kinds of infrastructure that the government has a role in providing, from roads to airports to public crime and firefighting services and a variety of things. And so, to the extent that can support activity, that's useful. Research and development is an interesting question. I recently gave a speech on this topic and talked about some of the considerations about what role, if any, the government should play there. And I think, that, again, it's an issue debated among economists, but there's some argument to the fact that in a purely, without any government intervention, that purely basic research may be underprovided because the people who are doing that don't share in all the benefits from that. So there may be some case for government encouragement of basic research. And of course, you have a R&D tax credit. That's certainly one way. That there are other ways as well, support National Science Foundation and so on to support research and development. So I think the lesson of experience is that industrial policies which attempt to dictate exactly what companies, exactly what products are not generally very successful. There often is a role for government partnerships, to help create the basis where private sector can be very productive, particularly in high-tech areas.
Do you have any sense of how we might fare with the international community in terms of R&D investment?
We do pretty well, including both public and private. We are certainly the biggest absolute amount of, we have the biggest amount of, in absolute terms, of research and development investment. And we have a pretty high percentage of GDP as well. Some emerging markets like China are beginning to approach us, at least in terms of share of GDP, but we remain an R&D leader.
Thank you.
Mr. Flores.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Chairman Bernanke, for joining us today. I want to follow up on some of the questions we've had earlier today, and to talk about policy responses. As you said, you're worried about the federal government's fiscal sustainability as we move forward. And it looks to me like we don't really have to reinvent the wheel when it comes to policy responses. If you look at this chart that we have on the screen, you can see the differences in recoveries during the 2007-2011 timeframe versus 1982 to 1986. There was an article, or actually an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal this morning by Phil Graham and Mike Salon that said that if we had just followed the same policies that Reagan followed when he inherited a really bad economy, that we would have about 17 million more Americans working today, and that our GDP per family would be about $23,000 higher. So the basic question, I mean, we all recognize that the Constitution says the federal government has certain basic responsibilities. It's explicit that we have to provide for national security. Some people feel like we need to provide for basic research funding, and I agree with that particular idea. But then everything else is really sort of on the table when you look forward. So my questions are fairly simple. I'd like you to give me the abbreviated, abridged, Reader's Digest fed response, if you can. Who's the better allocator of capital to the greater public good? Is it the private sector or the federal government?
Well, as I was saying earlier, there are some areas where the federal government is really the only provider. It's very hard to get the private sector to provide
Just macro, let's take
roads.
really 50,000.
But for, innovative industries and those sorts of things, I think it generally agreed that the private sector is better. And China is an example of a country which has a communist party running the show, but they allow private sector activity a very large role in the development of new industries.
Right. How about, you've got difference between private sector investments like the Keystone Pipeline versus public sector investments like Solyndra. That one's pretty opposite. Pretty obvious at face value that the federal government does a pretty poor job of allocating resources. Do you see anything that should dissuade us from thinking that it'd be better for the private sector to allocate resources instead of the federal government?
Well, again, the private sector, because of the profit motive and so on, is often better in innovating. But again, I don't want to get into the Keystone situation. Don't know enough about it, but I do know it involves a multi-state, right of way and all those environmental issues.
I wasn't trying to get the weeds on Keystone. I'm just saying, as an example, you've got on one hand you've got a private investment of $7 billion and thousands of jobs created. On the other hand, you've got $500 million taxpayer dollars that was spent and no jobs today.
You can, to be fair, you can point to situations where government investments in the space program or in the internet have paid off. Have paid off for the public, but clearly we have a market economy, and we want to use the market wherever appropriate.
Good, exactly. Looking at the stimulus plan, if you use the most aggressive, optimistic numbers of jobs created or saved that have been promulgated, the cost of the stimulus plan divided by the number of jobs is about $400,000 per job. Would you say that the private sector could have done better than that if we had just said, okay, private sector, through some sort of tax reform or tax reduction, we're going to leave those stimulus dollars in the hands of the taxpayers to start with instead of cycling them through Washington? Would that have created a better economic outcome for the United States?
Well, it's hard to say. We were in a deep recession, and one of the differences between this recession and the 82, 86 was that the Fed's tightening to reduce inflation was one of the main reasons for the 82 recession. And so when the Fed relented and cut interest rates, that was a big reason for the recovery. In this case, rates are zero. We can't do as much as they did in the mid-80s. So I'm sorry. So your question, well, so the other thing I guess I would comment is that dividing the total cost by the number of jobs to me is not exactly the right way to think about it, because the total cost involved also the provision of whatever was built or constructed.
I wasn't trying to get into the gnats like that. I'm just saying, in a macro level, what would have been a better policy response? What would have produced a better economic benefit for the average American? A, $800 billion in the hands of the taxpayers, or B?
If I could just quickly respond, I think there are times when monetary and fiscal policy can help to create better employment, but the private sector clearly is where the decisions about what industries, what products, and so on should take place.
Very good. Thank you.
Ms. McCollum.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, back to the chart that we just had. Could I ask to have that put up again, even though it was not my chart? Chairman Bernanke, some of my colleagues are talking about the Reagan recovery a lot more. But I think when you talk about recoveries, you also have to talk about how you got in the position you're in. You talked about how the Fed had interest rates to work with during the the so-called, the recovery, not so-called, we did recover during the recession that was pointed out with Mr. Bergen. But I think it's important historically to point out that with what we're facing